Welcome everyone to Unsheathed Sword Reviews. I'm Vic.
And I'm John.
And today we're going to review the Valiant Armoury - Angus Trim Vision Ansbach.
So that's a pretty complicated name with seems like a lot of folks involved in it. Why don't you talk a little bit about what the hell's going on with this thing?
All right, so real quick, here's the deal. So you guys might know who Angus Trim is. He's a very well-known American sword maker. He makes some amazing medieval swords. You might know who Valiant Armoury are. Nailed it, first try. They are a high-end sword maker that makes some really, really good swords, but they're specifically known for their high-end like leather work. So what the Vision line of swords is, it's a collaborative effort between the two. It is basically the handling, the blade harmonics, all the specs of the Angus Trim type swords with the hilt construction, the leather work, and all of that of Valiant Armoury. So if you look at Valiant Armoury's website at their swords, they are very, very pretty. They are very well-made swords.
Okay.
Angus Trim swords, while they handle amazingly, their hilts are all well done, but very kind of uniform, very similar in look and all that. So,
sure.
And is a really, really exciting joint effort between them. This specific sword, the Ansbach, is the third in that line of swords.
Okay. So in terms, like, again, you know a lot more about medieval swords than I do. Can you tell me a little bit about this, like in terms of the typology and what it's used for?
Sure. So this sword is actually one of my favorite longsword types. This is an Oakshot type 16A. So this kind of sword is a really, really good all-arounder. It is predominantly used for the thrust, but without sacrificing any kind of cutting capability. So as you notice, it has a very, very broad-looking blade that slowly tapers to a pretty acute point, but not as acute as, say, a 15A or an 18A or something like that. Most of the time, they have a hexagonal cross-section and a pretty deep fuller running most of the way up the blade. With how wide they are, they usually have a very, very good cutting capability. They have really good thrusting capability. They come on a variety of different hilts. We'll talk more about this one later, but this is a very good all-around longsword.
Excellent, excellent. So you mentioned that the Valiant Armoury contribution is to the fit and finish. And I can't talk enough about the fit and finish on this sword. I think it's absolutely beautiful. The cord wrap on the handle is amazing looking. I love the color of the leather. It's got some variations in it that make it look very natural. It's very much as it's a higher end aesthetic, it also fits with my sort of less refined taste because of the way the leather looks, but it is still absolutely beautifully finished. It is a great fit and finish on this sword. There are no rough edges any place. The fuller is damn near perfectly symmetrical. It's a great looking sword. It's just unbelievable. I'm sort of speechless when I pick it up, particularly after handling a lot of lower end sort of, arming swords and long swords. When you pick this up, you know what you're spending the money on, and some of that comes out in the handling, which we'll talk about later, but the fit and finish on this is immaculate.
Yeah, I agree. So what is the price on this, just so people are...
I think it's $12.95.
Yeah, so it's $12.95
US dollars.
Yeah.
$12.95 US dollars.
For just the sword, if you get the scabbard, I believe it's $17.95. So you're paying a lot more. But again, one of the things Valiant Armoury is known for is a really, really good scabbards.
Amazing leather work. Yeah,
yeah. We don't have the scabbard. I opted just to buy the sword itself. But you're right. A big part of this review is whether or not this sword justifies that price point.
Because it's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
$1,300 is a lot of money for anybody.
And so just looking at the hilts, it's about as perfect as I would want it to be. Again, I'm a sucker for a good leather cord wrap with risers. This has all of those. Mm-hmm. It feels really good. The shape of the grip allows for really, really good indexing up top, but like really good grip and, counterbalance at the bottom.
Absolutely.
My favorite type of pommel might be the scent stopper pommel, and this is one of the most elegant looking ones that I've seen.
Pretty scent stopper.
Because, some scent stopper pommels could be more angular, some are a little bit longer. This has that perfect, just kind of rounded shape to it. The peen is really well done.
Absolutely.
Combined with the subtle, like, upswept guard. Nailed it for try. The hilt just looks absolutely gorgeous. The only thing that I will mention, we'll talk about this a little bit more on the handling, is if you don't grip it right under the top riser, if you choke up on the guard, it can create a little bit of hot spots.
Sure, because it's square at the bottom. It isn't rounded off on the bottom so much.
And mostly because of the decorative bits in the guard right there. I'll show a close-up of it. That can start to scratch it. Just a little bit, not enough that would deter me from using it that way, but it's just a thing to note.
Especially if you're wearing a glove, it wouldn't bother you at all.
At all.
Yeah.
But one thing that we noticed when we were talking about this sword, when we first like unboxed it after we filmed that video, check it out in the description, is that the aesthetic of this kind of is like a neat middle ground for both of us.
It really is, yeah. I completely agree with that because I tend to prefer a less refined aesthetic. Not that I want huge gaps in the crossguard or anything like that, but I like a sword that looks like, you know, it's been used, or like, you know, maybe it would like be handed to your average guardsman. Like I don't need the king sword. Vic, however, wants the king sword.
Yeah. I do, and this is, you know, especially when you start looking at the blade, this isn't like CNC milled the way like an Albion sword is, right?
Nope.
It is still hand forged,
Yes.
but this is about as good as a hand forge as you're gonna get.
Absolutely.
But that said, when you're looking down the blade, you do see some rippling.
Sure. Yep.
You will see the fuller waver just a little bit, the central ridge. There's a little bit of asymmetry.
It's a handmade sword, and it looks it, and it should, I think, in my opinion.
But some mid-range and even low-end swords, the handmade aesthetic can start to bother me. Asymmetry bothers me. I'm bougie that way. I don't apologize. That said, this sword's asymmetry just adds a little bit of character to it that I really like.
It's close enough that you can tell it's extremely well made, and you can also tell it's not machine made.
Right.
So it's kind of a really cool middle ground, like you said.
And it almost makes you just appreciate how well handmade it. You know what I mean? Because you know it's like one dude doing that.
Absolutely,
So
yeah, these are masters at their craft on both ends of things.
Yes.
On the blade harmonic side, from HM, and you know, from the Valiant Armoury side, the leather work and the fit and finish. It's a beautiful sword.
And quick note on the gap in the crossguard. You guys know that's probably the thing that I'm the most nitpicky about. Mwah, perfect. It's so toy. It is toy like a toiger. It looks freaking gorgeous. A thing that we should talk about real quick is that it usually comes, unless you're ordering it directly from Valiant Armoury, you could change the grip color and whether or not you want the guard and pommel to have antiquing or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
This did come with that, but the pommel and the guard got a wee bit rusted. And that's one thing I want to mention.
When it showed up, that's right.
It had some rust on it when it showed up. And I cleaned it off. It wasn't that big of a deal. We'll post a picture if we have one. But after the fact, I will say a downside to this sword, and I've noticed other people that have swords in this line say the same thing. They're very rust prone.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed random rust spots on the blade, and there was one particularly bad incident where we were cutting with it, and you know I wiped off the water, and I was gonna let it sit for a minute before I oiled it. I forgot about it for about a day and a half. Now you shouldn't do that. Let's make that very clear. But that shouldn't be enough to where I show up, look at the sword, and there's red rust all over the guard and pommel and on the blade. And I'm not talking like light surface rust like you would probably expect after a day and a half. It was red. Like I do have pictures of this that I'll show you. And it, you know, I scared because it was my baby and I love it so much. So I managed to get all of it off, but I did remove some of the antiquing, specifically on the pommel. So that's kind of a shame. So if you do have any of these swords or you're looking to buy, keep them very, very well oiled. Maybe even go with Renaissance wax.
That's what I do too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the blade, I think, is 5160 on this, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, I mean, it tends to rust a little bit more than one, but usually not that bad.
I have other swords that are 5160 and they're not that prone, so I don't know what it is.
And are the pommel and the guard, are they mild steel? I think they're mild steel.
I believe they're mild steel.
And so I've got some other swords that have mild steel grips and guards, and they haven't been terribly rust prone either. A couple of my dark sword ones have mild steel, and I haven't had that problem. So I don't know what exactly the blend that they have going on here is with this steel, but yeah, it does seem a little more rust prone.
So yeah, just be aware of that if you're gonna spend the money on this. All right, so handling. What do you think, John?
Man, this is where this sword shines. Like if obviously we like swords more than most people. If you're watching this video, you probably like swords more than most people. If I was going to hand somebody a sword and be like, hey, this is what a sword should feel like in your hand, this is the one I would hand them. This sword and we were talking about it before when we were cutting. It's a great sword for beginners because it makes you feel like a Jedi Knight, but it's probably not a great sword because it's very forgiving, and it's gonna compensate for your mistakes and your inadequacies, which are good because our inadequacies are many. But in general, it's probably not a great sword to learn on for that reason. But I've never felt, for lack of a better word, a swordier sword than this. It is the best handling sword I think I've ever held.
It makes you feel mighty.
Yes,
it is, and so okay. We'll talk about it more in the overall value aspect of it, but when you pay high-end money for a sword, you're paying for fit and finish, and you're paying for handling, and this knocks it out the park in both of those, in my humble opinion. This sword feels air quotes humble. This sword is freaking amazing to cut with, and if you watched our video review on the Mad Eastern Royal Armoury's 14th century sword, we talk about that sword being so heavy and very dedicated to its thrusting capabilities that you pick it up and it's heavier than you expect, but it's still like, you know, still fun to
Lively,
move.
Yeah.
This sword, you look at it and you think it's going to feel heavier because of how broad the blade is. You pick it up, and especially if you cut with one and then the other, and it's just like, what am I even holding?
There's no comparison. And again, even the dimensions aren't that much different, but it's just the way this sword feels in your hand. It's unbelievable.
And again, that's not like a knock on the quality of the other sword. That's just very
Different
purpose-built.
Very different purposes. Yeah.
Which is crazy to think about because, again, they were existed around the same time period. And so, like, it's a really cool way to, like, look at what purpose do I want my sword to have?
Exactly.
And this sword, this is the funnest sword I have in terms of going out and cutting anything, really. One-handed cuts, you pull it off and you feel just like a monster. Two-handed cuts, it's so lively, it's so agile. Even my girlfriend, who doesn't really know anything about swords, but likes to cut stuff because it's fun. First time I put this in her hand and she was doing some cuts, the maniacal look on her face was hilarious. And so even a novice who has no idea what they're doing can pick this up and feel like a badass. And I feel like that's exactly what a sword in this price category should do.
I definitely agree with that. Like I said, I'm not even a European sword guy. These are not it's not my thing, not my bailiwick. But this sword is just, it's amazing. I love playing with it. Anytime I get a chance to play with it, I do. So
yeah. So all of that said, you know, the sword handles like a dream. It looks amazing and all that. The elephant in the room is the price.
Yeah. So, and that's really the question is, if you can afford a $1,300 sword, this is probably the one you should get. So I think it is absolutely worth the money, assuming you have $1,300 to spend on a sword. Some people don't, and that's okay. And, you know, we try at our channel, we try to make it so that we review things that are low end, mid range, and high end, so that it's useful for everybody. But if I had $1,300 to throw at a sword tomorrow, this is the one I would buy. Just absolutely. So I think it lives up to that value if you have that money to spend on a sword. So absolutely, can't recommend it enough. What do you think, Vic?
I agree. If you can afford to buy high-end swords, this definitely deserves a place in your collection.
Yeah.
If you're the kind of person that wants to save up for one high-end sword or maybe two high-end swords, you know what I mean?
This would be a good one.
This is worth saving up for.
Yeah.
This wasn't a sword that I bought just right away when it came out. Like, it was one that I thought about. I remember sending you, like, you know, the link to it a bunch of times.
Yeah.
And finally, you're like, dude, just do it. Like, we talked about it.
And honestly, when he sent it to me, I was like, dude, that's $1,400 or $1,300. You can get a lot of swords for $1,300. And then when he got it, I was a believer. I was like, okay, I see what that money's for. I get it. It makes sense.
And so that's the thing. Like, you might have $1,300. You could buy 3 pretty good swords for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you get them used, you probably get 4 really good swords for it.
So that's the thing. If this kind of sword appeals to you, if having a high-end piece, like, honestly, like, I have a lot of swords. This is the pride of my collection. Not just because it's the most expensive, but because it's, like, the best.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to pick a favorite amongst your babies, but this is probably my favorite. Gun to my head. So
it's a lot of money, but I think that every dollar spent is you get something for it. I don't feel like any money's wasted on this. I think it's completely worth what you spend on it.
I completely agree. Scott also, unsurprisingly, loved the freaking sword. He's a big fan of, like, two-handed longswords, so he thought this was really fun and moves really well. But I haven't put this in anybody's hands who didn't like it, and I feel like that's, like, you know, the testimony. So
absolutely.
All right, closing thoughts?
Buy it if you can do.
Jump on it, buy it.
Yeah,
it's definitely worth it. So, hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of Unsheathed Sword Reviews.
Hey,
John,
what do we got coming up next, Vic?
That's a good question. We have an axe. We're going to talk about an axe.
We are going to talk about an axe.
That axe, actually. Look at that.
We're going to ask several good questions about it.
You just were trying to set up that pun, weren't you? He's so funny. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Unsheathed Sword Reviews. Like and subscribe. Do all the things. Peace.